Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about voice types and what that means. And I hopefully will help sort of just clear up some of the confusion that we often have when you're looking online about voice types and trying to figure out, like, what is my voice type? How do I fit into the spectrum of voices? Um, in general, I think it's really important to note that, like, this tends to be a source of a lot of confusion. It tends to be a source of a lot of controversy. And there's actually a very important reason why. We'll get into that in a second. And also, with this one, like, I really recommend, like, ask questions. It might be hard for me if you're like, what voice type am I? Because that's something that you want to, like, listen to someone's voice and get a longer sense of sort of what their voice does over time. So I always say, in general, don't be quick to put yourself in a box. Sometimes when we over classify or over fixate on, like, what our voice type is, that's when we sometimes run into issues actually with our voice. Again, happy to happy to answer some questions that you might ask about this. But I'm just going to go over sort of the different variables that you can use to assess your voice. Um, and yes, if you improperly classify your voice, that can lead to some vocal difficulties, injury, problems down the road. So it is important to kind of get a sense of generally where your voice is most comfortable, but always pay attention to what it feels like. And so that's going to be the most important thing to do. And it's really important to note that you'll discover your voice type over time, meaning that as you develop your voice, you might realize that you have these new things that are available to your voice: more volume, more weight, or sort of power in your sound, a darker, more like relaxed timbre, or more brightness in your sound as you learn to actually explore different kinds of techniques. So your range will expand as you learn to use your voice appropriately. So there's all sorts of things like that that just come with time as you develop your voice. So don't be like, I need to figure out my voice first before I start working on, voice lessons or improving your vocal technique. A lot of times that's part of the process. The main thing I want to talk about here is when it comes to voice types, if you're looking online and you're getting really confused, like, you're not alone. The reason is there's not a clear universal system, actually. And that's just really important to note. So when you get, like, people who are like, oh, this doesn't make any sense, and, like, I know the answer, they may just be using a different system. There are some overarching patterns and things that we'll talk about as you start to kind of compare different kinds of systems. Um, but it's really important to note that there really is not a universal system. That's where a lot of the confusion and controversy comes into play. And there are sometimes, like, oversimplifications, and then there's sometimes way too specific, like, classifications, or, they're going to be very specific for a reason. And so we'll go over that. So I'm going to start with kind of like the simplest system in my mind, and we'll talk about sort of the limitations of that. And then we'll go into the more and more specific things. And yes, please ask questions. Like, I'm not an expert on every single type of system, but I know enough of, like, the kind of the main ones to give you a really good sense of, like, the overarching sort of uh, concept that's happening here. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is what we call the choral system, or choral music. That's probably in a lot of ways, like, the simplest way of categorizing voices, and I'll explain why. Um, yeah, it's funny, right? You might get, like, this sort of, like, voice type confusion, like what you're mentioning. Like, someone's like, "No, you're this type. Oh, no, you're this type, or you're this type." And again, like, don't put yourself in a box. You might actually find that you have a lot of different options or some flexibility. And again, when we talk about voice types, it's a way that, like, for example, like, a performance group or venue might categorize, like, the type of singer who's going to show up. And so sometimes it's just, like, a matter of, like, something that's, like, functional for us to, like, give some sort of identification. But it's ultimately can sometimes we like kind of lose ourselves a little bit in the concept of categorizing. So just think of it as, like, a broad spectrum. And I think it is important to understand the different sort of aspects that we use to kind of help categorize voices. That can guide you towards different kinds of practices that you might do, or different roles, or um, other things that might be happening with your voice. And so it is important, but sometimes people like way over fixate on it, and it kind of makes me laugh a little bit because it's just like sometimes not that helpful. And then sometimes people, like will get like angry online and things like that and be like, this doesn't make any sense because of blah, 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 blah. That kind of makes me laugh just because when you actually understand this whole thing that's happening and all the different kind of systems and there's sort of like controversies in the way that they sort of overlap, you'll realize that it's just kind of a little bit of a mess because there is not like a universal system. It's just the truth of it. But there's still a lot that we can learn. So we're going to start with the choral system. So this is for choral music, right? Singing in an ensemble. And with this one, the reason I want to start with it is it's kind of the most simplistic, and it really is generally just based on range. So it's funny, right? You might think the first thing is like, voice type really is just purely about range. I think there's more complexity to it than that, but this is a good place to start. So you can get a sense of generally what sort of side of the staff, the musical staff that you sing on. So when we're talking about the choral system, we're really dividing it up into 4 different categories. We have very low male singers, and that's going to be a bass. And then you have or you could call it baritone. It's the B when we talk about SATB, um, bass baritone. Then you have the higher male vocalist, and again, not always gendered, although it can be, there you can have female tenors and things like that. But it's just for really oversimplifying, I'm going to use this sort of concept, and we'll get into some of the nitty gritties in a bit. So we've got bass baritone, then we've got tenor. That's the higher male vocalist. Then we have alto, and that is a lower female vocalist in the most broad way of thinking about this. And then we have soprano, which is the highest female vocalist. So with this, we're talking about pretty much just like 4 different types. We've got like male low, male high, female low, female high. And it's really just about range. So when we're talking about like a bass, we're talking about someone who, on average, again, this is where there's controversy because it's a spectrum. People are like, well, my voice goes lower, so that's like you're wrong about the notes that you're saying. You have to understand that there is a range. And then there's this is why we have like extra categories when people have like a really low extension. There's a word for that. But in general, like overarchingly, your basses are going to be around this sort of like E2 area. So I can't even demonstrate down here because I am a tenor, or we could talk about some of the other ways you might classify my voice depending on how I'm using it. But we have really low here, so like E2, and then usually you want to think about like a 2-octave range is a kind of the most generic way of thinking of a voice. There's voice extension when we talk about like range extension. How do you get a little lower or a little higher from there? Be like, oh, well, I have a 3-octave range. It's because you've got some extension. But in general, you're going to have this E2 up to about E4, right? And that's going to be a really comfortable sort of bass baritone range in the choral system. Again, we're going to talk about some other complexities here when people are like, well, you're way oversimplifying. Well, it just depends on what system you're talking about. So we've got that. Then we've got our tenor system. With that, we're talking about pretty much this C here. So that's like C3 up to about C5, actually. So you can see there's about like a 5th difference. Now, some basses can go lower down here, and some tenors, da, 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 they can kind of sort of get a note out here. Like I'm not like comfortable singing this all the time, but I can make some sound down there. And that's an A below this C3. So that's generally the sort of bass range. Again, is these octaves here. So really low, can't sing that. Na, no, it's gonna feel like pretty high and might be starting, might be in like head voice at this point for a bass baritone. For a tenor, da, that's pretty low. And then, no, that's probably gonna be in head voice, although you can sing it full voice is what we call like a high C for a tenor. Um, then we get into sort of the alto realm. This is where we think of, again, the low female voice type in general. There's overlap, so don't get mad at me for over gendering it, but this is just again to really simplify things. Um, it doesn't have to be fully gendered. So for this, we're thinking about like F3 is a very low note, but it's generally able to be sung by an alto singer. So right around here, and then we're gonna think 2 octaves, right? So you can just think of 2 numbers up uh, on your or 2 octaves up, right? And keep with that note. So you've got F, F, and then all the way up at F5 is going to be pretty high, but that's generally going to work. Now, if we're talking about, and that's going to be fully in head voice, it's going to feel like kind of at the tippy top of your range. Some altos, that's too high. And again, you might be like, I can't get up there. Some of it's about technique too, right? So sometimes you can develop your voice, expand your range. And again, just because you can't hit up there doesn't mean like, oh, well, I'm a failed alto because I don't have my full extent of my range. Again, it is a spectrum and it is an average, right? There are many different voices and it's about what's comfortable. And we're just loosely trying to categorize these ranges. And then we have sopranos, which we're thinking about almost kind of like an octave above the tenor, right? So this is a high female voice, and we're going from C4 to C5 to C6. And that really high note, again, I'm not going to sing up there because that's not where my range is. And this is the whole point. Like, if you're not a high soprano, don't be trying to hit those high C's, is what we call them, like a C6. You might really hurt yourself, especially if you haven't walked your way up and found where your tension point is. So this is like the most basic way of thinking about voice type is with range. It's not the only thing. And I think when you just think of range, it's going to be kind of limited. So in this sort of world of like choral music, and you might even be like, you know what, choral music has other things involved too. In general, the choral system is about range and sort of where, on the staff, like your voice is going to sit so that you can appropriately like voice 4-part harmony and not make someone who's a tenor sing out of their range and hurt themselves, right? And when we do this, and everyone's singing generally in the middle of whatever that range is, we're going to be singing fairly comfortably. And that's going to allow for a nice sort of beautiful harmony that's going to happen so that we can be balanced with our voices. So that's pretty much like the choral system. So when you're thinking about SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, that's what we're talking about there. And that's a very rudimentary way of dividing up the spectrum of voices from all the way from very low down here, maybe a little bit lower, all the way up to here, and sometimes a little bit higher. Yeah, so this is what's interesting. Okay, good. I'm going to answer some of these questions. I love this. And then we'll get into the next 2 systems and sort of where this adds more complexity, sort of where these systems come from. Oh, yeah. So, when my practice and my training, what's it's interesting to kind of understand is I started out actually singing like kind of like contemporary music, playing guitar, singing folk songs, doing musical theater stuff. And then I started training classically, and I did choral music also as a kid. So I have a little bit of every background, but then I like more specifically trained in classical music because I wanted to have that really traditional understanding and to just feel out like the extent of my range. In a lot of ways, I think of classical music as kind of like the Olympics of singing, right? You're really working on all these different on like your full expression of your voice. Again, there's some limitations because a lot, for guys like in classical music, we tend to sing purely in kind of chest to chest mix. But with choral music, there's head voice involved and things like that. But I trained more with that also because I wanted to understand more of the history and vocal pedagogy and those kinds of things. And currently I sing all styles. So I kind of like went full circle. I like started more just traditional, not traditional. I started more like contemporary, like what most people kind of end up doing, uh, and then went to classical, really specialized, and then now I do a mix of all of them because I just love all the different genres, and I think there's a place for all of them. And I think learning how to do different types is really good for your voice, and you can understand just sort of the full range of expression with your voice and how each category can help out the others. Um, so I've got a mix, and I do like to teach that way so that you can understand like what's the difference between singing, a country style compared to like classical. I have a little less. I didn't grow up singing gospel music like as like some may have like more specialty in that, but I've done some things where I've worked on gospel and R&B and jazz. But we all have like areas of focus. So I do have a lot of that classical influence as well, actually. But I think that like a lot of classical vocalists could really benefit from understanding head voice singing, mixed voice function, and more stylization in the contemporary realm. So I think there's a lot to be learned from both sides. Um, Now, this is a good question that Florista has. When you're a mezzo, where do you sing in choral music? This is where sometimes it can be really troublesome and people can get kind of frustrated because you could be put in as a soprano based on like who's there singing and what the person, conductor is sort of hearing from your voice. So there's a lot of reasons strategically why someone might put you on one side or the other. So you sometimes might be put in as a soprano, and sometimes you might be put in as an alto, and certain pieces might end up being too low or too high for you because of that. And we're going to talk about what does mezzo soprano mean. So not everyone necessarily knows that yet, but we'll get to this. There's also like understanding in choral music. There's often we use like 1 and 2 as a sort of a way to further divide things up. So you'll have like um, bass 2, bass 1, right? And 2 is going to be lower in this system. So then you have tenor 2, tenor 1, alto 2, alto 1, soprano 2, soprano 1. So if you're a mezzo, you're probably going to be more as a soprano 2 or an alto 1, right? Depending on the music. So sometimes we just, like in my group that I sing with, the choral lab, we often will like mix and match. And sometimes we'll particularly have a category for singers as like the flip singers, right? Mezzo flip, where they can kind of sing up in head voice, sing down, in sort of more of an alto realm as well, depending on how many part splits and things that we have in more complicated music. And over time, you get to know different singers. So, like in the choir that I'm in, like I kind of know which singers are more comfortable hanging out in certain places. But we always just ask, like, how do you feel on this? And someone after a concert might be like, you put me in a soprano too, and with this particular music, it was just a little grueling and kind of taxing. So I want to be down lower next time. And that's really important. If you're a choral conductor, listen to your singers. Just because you put someone in one camp doesn't mean that things can change over time. And you want to make sure that they're not, like really hurting themselves trying to do whatever music. Again, like music in different time periods have different parameters too, because older music tends to think more towards classical choral. And if you're doing like more pop contemporary show choir, the range is actually maybe going to be a little different. So that's the choral music system. And then sometimes you get like, it'll say like contralto instead of alto, and that sometimes was an interchangeable term with alto. Although in some schools we think of contralto as an extra low alto. So let's get into the next thing. So I give this next category the category that I mainly try to think about, which is the vocal pedagogy system. Which again, like some people will be like, there is no vocal pedagogy system. Like there are different schools of thought here as well. And this is why it's controversial. I think a really nice way of dividing up voice types is to think about generally 3 categories for each gender. And there's a little bit of interchange in the middle, and we'll talk about those sort of extra special types. We have bass, we have baritone. So this is bass is extra low male singer. Baritone is in the middle. And then we have tenor, which is again the high version. So in this sort of system, we think of low, middle, and high. It just gives us extra options. Sometimes we think about this in choral music, or we're going to use this just to be a little bit more specific to understand. Well, this person's not really like a low bass; they're more of a baritone or a high baritone by that, right? So again, you could see this is just a way to start to kind of get a sense of how every voice sort of fits in with the others. Um, but I think three systems, thinking low, middle, high, is going to be more versatile. You can get more specific, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think that's actually a really nice sort of kind of compromise between being overly simplistic and having a little more subdivision. So that's the idea here. Is we've got low, middle, high. Um, in general, the middle voices are going to be more common. Some people also are like, no, tenors are more common. I kind of don't think so. I think in general, the extremes are less common, and you have it just kind of almost a little more of an intuitive thing. We don't have like comprehensive studies with this, but in general, I think middle voices, think of it more like there's more room for a kind of high baritone or a bass baritone or slightly low baritone. So it's just more overlap there in the middle. So bass, baritone, tenor. That's going to be like the more sort of vocal pedagogy kind of contemporary realm that we kind of think about. Again, that's like a lot of teachers are going to use those categories. Now, when we think of our upper voices, we have alto, mezzo soprano, and soprano. So mezzo soprano is that in the middle place again. And actually, a lot of female vocalists are mezzo sopranos. And it's like an identity crisis because there's a lot of overlap there, right? So this is about sort of like kind of living in between chest voice and head voice and doing a lot of mixing a lot of the time. Whereas when you think of like the male voices, they tend to be, it's funny, even in like if you look at the old categorization systems, a lot of the male voices, they don't talk about head voice that often. They just talk about chest voice. So there's, like back in the day, it was a little more gendered. It was like men sing in chest voice and women sing in head voice. And then if you keep going even further back and you go to like early music, guys were singing in head voice and they were doing female roles actually. So it's just kind of changed over time. And that's why this is like kind of a nightmare sometimes when people are looking it up and they're like, get all up in arms about it. And I think it's just important to understand that it's messy a little bit and that over categorizing yourself again can be an issue. So when we go up into the upper voice types, we tend to do a lot more chest to head voice. And especially if you're in the middle as a mezzo soprano, you're going to be flipping back and forth. So sometimes people call it like the mezzo flip, right? Where you're like singing in chest voice and then you like pop up into head voice. But you're not like a very light, constantly up in your head voice kind of a singer. That would be more towards a soprano. So with this kind of concept, let's start to divide it out. We'll talk about range again, but I'm going to add to it, right? So when we've got our bass, right? Think again like E2 to E4. And there are extensions. So, and there's even some really, really low singers. Like look up the Guinness World Record of lowest voice. We call that like a basso profundo, right? The most profound or the lowest bass. Or, in other instruments, we call it a contrabass, right? So that's just like a very, very low singer. So we're going to get some extra little titles here. But generally here, now when we're thinking about baritones, we're thinking about like A2 to like A4, right? Use the 2-octave rule because I think this simplifies things. Now, some people are like, I've even in some of my videos where I'm just kind of trying to show a little bit of like where the baritone range is from the perspective, again, of a tenor. My timbre is very tenory, so like do not mistake me for a baritone. I could sometimes, if I like wake up early in the morning, doing like an early gig or something like that, and I don't warm up very much, can sometimes fake some baritone. And in choral music, I could sometimes do baritone 1, for example, right? If it doesn't get too low, I'll just fade out a little bit in the low notes because I'm singing with other people. But baritones can sometimes, that's a dun dun, can sometimes be down at this low F as well. So that's like thinking about like the F2, right? So that is in the realm of baritones. You might think of that person as like a bass baritone though, right? Somewhere in between. So just, if you're looking online at voice types, you'll see like the green window of like what's most common. And then there's this extension, which is often like the yellow zone. And then the red zone is probably where you're starting to hurt yourself and push. But there's extension, and your voice fluctuates over time. Like as you get older, it might drop a little bit lower. Or if you, smoke cigarettes, for example, like that tends to make people's voices drop a little bit lower over time. It kind of paralyzes the vocal folds and the hair follicles there and things like that. And it will make it sound a little lower, a little raspier, kind of slows down the motion. So these things change over time as well. Hormonal shifts, that also changes things. Obviously, like people go through voice change. But it's important to note that it's not just like fixed for life. And you might notice this with like some famous singers when you hear them late in their life and all of a sudden they're singing their songs like some keys down. Some of it's like health related, but some of it is also just like their voice has dropped and they're not able to maintain being up in the high register that they used to be in. So let's keep going, right? So we've got this new category of baritone. And then we did tenor, right, which is C3 to C5 with a little bit of overlap, going down this way, and then sometimes going up this way. And we sometimes call this like a counter tenor. And there's a lot of debate over what counter tenor means, but it's usually like an extra high tenor. But there's also other things like, do you sing a lot more in your head voice, right? There's some terms here that we'll talk about, which I think is funny. Like, so sometimes people consider me a countertenor just because I've worked on a lot of head voice singing. But I also, again, just understanding voice types, I can sometimes sing down on the lower extension of tenor towards those A's. So what does that mean? I don't know. Like, is it really authentically a countertenor? A lot of times when you get countertenor singers, their speech voice, and that's another thing to think about and listen to. It's not always the case, but their speech voice is going to be up in like this kind of higher place. You're going to sound like, like you're like Michael Jackson or something like that, right? You're going to sound like you're up in this sort of higher, lighter place. And, sometimes people get like, on the phone, like they get confused as, who they're talking to. Because that voice is sitting in such like a high light place. Again, this is not to try and label people. It's really just to help understand how all the voices generally kind of fit together and what you should be sort of doing with your voice. So range, again, is a very, very rudimentary way of explaining this. So then we keep going and we've got altos, right? Again, which is like F3 to F5. There are contraltos, right? So that's a term for sometimes interchangeable with alto in old school language. But it also is someone with a lower extension. Like I like to always talk about like, like Tracy Chapman or someone like that, where, you can get down into here and almost like overlaps with tenor and countertenor. So it's a matter of like what perspective you're looking at. If you're thinking of like countertenor and contralto, there is some overlap there. And again, that's where it's like, is that a gendered term or is it like about positions? Like if you're singing in a group and you're just trying to sort of mark out, well, that person's a little bit higher than that person, and we want them to sing in harmony together, and sometimes overlap and things like that. So a lot of the times, like these terms are almost just more musical terms, right? Then it's weird when we get to like voice things, we think about gender a lot of the time, just because like a low bass is going to always pretty much be a male vocalist. A high soprano is pretty much always going to be a female vocalist, although things can change. So that's something to think about. So as we keep going, we get this mezzo category, which is kind of like the baritone up in octave. So we're thinking about like A3 to A5, right? And again, some fluctuation on either side. And then we're thinking again, soprano, we have that C4 to that high C6. And then there are like, we'll talk about like, what does it mean to be I'm a coloratura soprano or something like that. And I can sing up to like, all the way up to these high E's and sometimes even higher when we think about like whistle tone, which is like an extended technique, right? Where we can just go up even another octave, right? Or I can throat sing and I can drop an octave lower in the bass realm and sound like a subwoofer and things like that. So, right, there's some confounding features, but we generally also want to think about where our voice is most comfortable singing. So here's another term. It's not just range, but we have this fancy term called tessitura. It's another way that you want to think about your voice. Oh, it's all good. Welcome. We're talking, voice types. I already talked about the choral system. Now I'm talking about like a more sort of in the middle, what I think of as the most universal kind of system, which I call the vocal pedagogy system. There's different schools of thought here, but choral system, we divide it up into four categories: bass, tenor, alto, soprano, and sometimes twos, right? Thinking like two is a little lower and one is a little higher. When we talk about like the vocal pedagogy system, we're dividing it up more. We have bass, baritone, and tenor, alto, mezzo soprano, and soprano. So then we have this low, middle, high, and a little bit more of crossover. We talked a little bit about the extremes, as like the basso profundo, and what does the countertenor mean versus the contralto, things like that. Now we're talking, that a lot of that was talking about like vocal range, which is the place to start. Like what pitch can I actually do? Like, I don't know if you've seen those apps, right, where people like go like the, and then like woo, and like it's like congratulations, you're a baritone. Like that's somewhat helpful, but it's also not everything, because music is more complex than just the range that you can sing. So when we're talking about tessitura, which is this fancy term, it's kind of like the average. Like, where does your voice like to sit most of the time? And this is really important to note. Uh, Again, it can help push you if you're not sure, like, am I a bass or a baritone, or am I a tenor or a baritone? It can help you kind of like navigate that sort of identity crisis. Or mezzo soprano, like what Florista was saying, is like, if you're a mezzo, what should I sing as an alto or should I sing as a soprano? If your tessitura is such that singing in head voice all the time is fatiguing, and feels like it's kind of getting heavy or too loud, it's hard to blend with people, then you're probably going to get put into alto, or you should probably think about singing alto one, versus like if I'm singing in chest voice all the time, and it feels like heavy and I'm kind of dropping and pushing and I can't get a lot of sound out, then you're probably going to go towards soprano or soprano two. So you can see this is where we start to navigate based on our tessitura. So this is like, if you're in a song and you're singing, what is like the most common note that you're singing? Does it keep living in the low range, or does it, live in the middle, or does it like kind of constantly sit at the top part of your range? That's going to tell you something. So this is also like thinking about vocal fatigue, right? So if you're singing a lot in one range up in your high register and you're getting tired a lot, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily a bad singer. It can mean that your tessitura should be a little bit lower, and that tells you something about your voice type. So that's why sometimes we get these subcategories like a bass baritone or a baritenor, right? What do you think that is? It's just like there's a little bit of an in-between place. A baritenor is someone who's saying like, I can get up there and I can get some of these like brighter sounds. We'll talk about that too in a second. But I don't like want to live up there. Like I've got people sometimes where like if I want like a sub and they're like, well, are you singing like, are you singing these G's all the time? Like, nah. Or is it like that if you're doing that all the time, then like I need to, that I'm more of a baritenor. Like I'm cool if I just have to go up to here. No. But if I have to sit up in those G's and A's all the time in chest voice, like I'm not the right person for this gig. It's gonna fatigue me. I try to avoid that. That's a baritenor, right? And that has to do with tessitura. So that person, especially if you're a professional singer, is mindful of the fact that if they take too many high tenor roles or high choral gigs like that, it's going to start to be a detriment to their voice. And that's really, really important to kind of pay attention to. Like, I can kind of live up in the high tenor place, but if I haven't been practicing and I'm tired, then I'm going to want to be careful about that. And I might change my strategy, and, have to work with my voice a little bit more. So this is we always want to be present with our voice. If you put yourself in a box and you're like, well, I was a soprano in high school, so therefore I should just jump right back in like 10 years later as a soprano, like you might hurt yourself actually, because your voice might have shifted over time. And so that's why I'm always like, don't get lost in the category. Like use the categories to help navigate how your voice actually feels, and what you're noticing. And that's a way that you can communicate to a conductor or to a performance venue about the kind of voice that they're going to be experiencing, right? And that way they can better sort you or just name you appropriately how you feel like you want to be named, right? So that's really, I think, the important thing to understand here. So tessitura is something that you want to pay attention to, and I put it in the vocal pedagogy camp because it's a little bit about your vocal health, right? It's also about like your sweet spots, like where do I have the fullness in my sound? That gets us to the next concept, which is timbre. Don't get confused by calling it timbre, right? That's a material, and timbre is the quality of our sound. And so this is also kind of gets a little by it's a little confusing and it's a little bit by taste. So like, when you listen to voices, like that voice sounds very bright to me, or that voice sounds very dark to me, or warm, right? Or round, right? There's all these like descriptors people use when they describe timbre. Now, my question is, does anyone know, like, what does it really mean when we're talking about timbre, like from a scientific perspective? Try to keep everyone engaged here, so I'm not just lecturing all the time. Like, what do you think of when you think of the timbre of a voice or an instrument or anything like that? Um, and then I will chime in, but I'm just kind of curious if anyone, don't be shy, um, if anyone has a way that they like to think about this. Um, This is actually like when I'm talking about the voice, this is where I like to bring up concepts of resonance is kind of my hint, right? Because resonance does something. It tells you about your timbre and it explains that sound. Yeah, yes, yes, overtones, right? Yes, so when we're talking about timbre, you have to understand that when we sing like what we call the fundamental pitch, that's like when I'm talking about range, like that's middle C, right? That's the fundamental pitch. But when I'm singing, what makes my voice sound unique is that there are other overtones happening at the same time. Every sound, always, whenever you make a sound, there's these overtones that are happening in the harmonic series. It's always kind of like it's like a function of physics. Now, when we sing and we do certain vowel shapes, things like that, we're emphasizing different overtones and muting other overtones, and that's how we understand and can hear the difference between different vowel shapes. It's also the reason why different instruments have a different or unique sound, even if they're playing the same fundamental pitch. So, understanding resonance is one of the first steps to understanding timbre, which is, and also the function of your voice, of course. But timbre is essentially like the quality of your sound. It's like how much of certain overtones are you using. So, some voices have a lot of higher overtones, and we often call that like a brighter or a lighter, and we'll talk about weight too, but a brighter sound, um, that has to do with higher partials or higher overtones that are in the sound, and there's more of them. Now, there are overtone analyzers like vocal spectrogram kind of a thing that you can actually use to see what your overtones are like in your voice and compare them to other vocalists. If you have more sounds closer to the fundamental, lower overtones and warmth in your sound, that's going to give you that darker or warmer kind of sound when people are talking about it. So um, like if you've been like following or watching like the Building the Band sort of Netflix series, right? They often are trying to explain like, oh, that person has like a much deeper, kind of warmer sound, or that person has a really bright kind of timbre. They're explaining this, the way that we perceive overtones. And some of that's based on your technique, like how you stabilize your voice. Now, that is a way that we also understand voice type. So if we're thinking about like a baritone compared to a tenor, a baritone's probably going to have more lower overtones and a warmer sound compared to a tenor who's going to have perhaps a brighter sound. But again, there's a spectrum, right? Baritenor might have some brightness in their upper part of their voice, but can sometimes fill out the lower side. And so they're like in that sort of like identity crisis. Same thing with the mezzo soprano. They might have a decently full sound in their chest voice, and then can actually get pretty full in their head voice. And it could sound like one smooth line from one to the next. So that is a way that we also pay attention to voice types, is actually the quality or the timbre of your voice. You can see why this is like, it's hard to explain in like a short little like 10-minute YouTube video where you're teaching like a voice type and trying to get people into the concept of voice types. Um, yes, yes, overtones are harmonic frequencies that accompany the main pitch. That's a very good explanation of it. Whenever we make a vibration, there's always what we call a spectral envelope or a series of sounds that vibrate in ratios. It's the harmonic series, right? Which is this like, right? And always kind of have that sound of the universe sort of sound, right? Like, right, kind of has that sort of mysterious sound. That's because we hear that in every sound that ever happens. Like if I smack a thing, right? Um, there are these harmonics that are happening. It's also how we can kind of intuitively understand music in general, because every pitch that sounds actually has all the other pitches and information in it. That's why we can kind of like hear and sort of move towards certain things when we adjust our timbre by like thinking about singing in a minor mode or when we're doing complex choral harmonies and things like that. Those sounds are all in there, and we can actually fine tune our vowel shapes and everything else to get like just the right kind of quality so that those distantly related overtones make sense. So sometimes they sound like weird and they don't make sense, and sometimes you can make really, really strange sounds make sense actually based on the way that you adjust the timbre of your voice. So, fun fact. Um, but it comes with this concept that we actually have all these overtones in our sound. This is also how we do like mixed voice and change from chest voice to head voice, things like that. We're adjusting our formant or our vowel shape to these harmonics in our sound. So every time we make a sound and our voice starts sounding, they're already there. And we're kind of like surfing those overtones. So that's a really cool thing to understand. And I think a lot of the times people don't talk about resonance and they just think of it as like projecting your voice. Yes, it does make your voice project more, but it's more complex. It's also how we adjust our timbre. And we have range. Like we can sometimes sound darker based on our vowel shapes or brighter based on like, how our tongue position or tension in our jaw or the way we're purposefully kind of like pushing forward or collapsing the space. Um, so we have range over this, but only so much, right? And that's the kind of concept of timbre. Some voices have a naturally deeper or darker sound, and that doesn't necessarily define your voice type, but it is a variable. So, right, if you have a really low voice, like low bass, and you have a really dark tone, and you like to sing really low all the time, then you're for sure probably a basso profundo, right, or a contrabass. Um, that's kind of a way that you can be a little bit more specific. So again, we have range, tessitura, which is where you like to most commonly be in a healthy way, and timbre. So that's like the quality of the overtones that you use a lot of the time. They're all related, right? So it's kind of fascinating when you think of it this way, and it just makes me laugh again when people are like getting all in the weeds about, well, my voice is like from A sharp to this note, and then like sometimes there, and I'm like, you're maybe getting a little too in the weeds, a little too specific, and you have to think about some of these other variables. Don't put yourself in a box because again, you might surprise yourself too as you learn how to use your voice appropriately. Um, but it's a good place to start, right? If you don't know and you aren't sure, like first go with what's comfortable and then move from there, and you'll discover your voice over time. So that's why I call this like the vocal pedagogy approach. It has a lot to do with understanding the voice, what's healthy, and yes, range. So the choral system is a little more functional of like, where do I put the voices and how do I stack them as I write music as a composer and things like that, right? It's very practical in that way. Vocal pedagogy is like maybe a little bit thinking more about the soloist or a little more complex in the choral sense. Um, so that's that thing. Now let's talk about when sometimes we'll be like, well, have you heard of the Fach system, right? Which I think is really interesting. This is when people talk about very specific categorized voices. The Fach system, when people say that, FACH is what we're talking. That's a German system, and it's based on opera. Now, what's funny is we have also like Italian words and French words for different kinds of voice types, all based on what I would like to call, instead of like the Fach system, is the classical operatic voice system. That's like the old school one. That's what people sometimes refer to when they're trying to be like, well, you are a novice and you don't understand the complexities of voice types, and therefore you've never heard of the Fach system. I purposefully, guilty here. I don't bring it up a lot of the time because I want this to be geared towards everyone and beginners. And I think there's a really important thing to note that's specific to opera. It is like helpful sometimes to think about these things, and it's fun to be like, I'm a coloratura soprano, or I'm a spinto tenor, or there's I'll name a couple of them, and just to really help kind of bring this home. Uh, that can be fun to like define some things. But it ultimately has a lot to do with types of roles that you're going to do in an operatic context. So that's why I sometimes I'm like a little bit like, oh yes, the Fach system. Um, I'm actually, I'm going to use words that are a little more like I haven't memorized the like German pronunciation. If you look up the Fach system, you'll see like exactly like the German pronunciation for all of these. But there is actually a system and a pattern to this that I think is important to kind of note. There's a lot about weight when we talk about these systems. There's also a little bit about character. And so that's what kind of defines this type of system. And again, there's one for almost every culture that was like ended up doing a lot of opera. Um, and so that's where those names come from. So weight, think of it as a little bit about the darkness, right? The timbre of your voice or brightness, but it also has to do with like the power of your sound. So are you a very like agile, like light singer who's jumping around a lot and very flexible? Or are you a very heavy park and bark kind of a singer who's like, oh, right? That kind of a thing. Like that's gonna, that's what we talk about with weight. So some of it has to do with like the extent of your vibrato, right? Versus sort of like some people talk about like big circle, little circle in terms of your voice and the kinds of character types. So the thing that we talk about here is we have coloratura, and you can almost think of this with every type, like alto, mezzo soprano, soprano, bass, baritone, tenor, and they often have like a coloratura type, which is a light and agile and often higher voiced type. Then we have what we call like the lyric type. That's like your slightly light, but like a little bit heavier and a little bit lower version, right? So you can see there's similarities, right, with all these different types, right? They're just trying to create main categories and subdivisions based on these variables: timbre, range, tessitura, and then let's add in weight, right? So that's the other concept. Um, and so, oh yeah, so when we're talking, I'll just answer this question. Like the tenors range C3 to C5. In some cases, people will talk about that as full chest voice, but I think it's not, that's kind of like a weird oversimplification because at that point in our voice, we're actually kind of mixing, right? So it's important to note that chest voice and head voice are teaching metaphors. And so by the time we're up there, like in classical music, we often want to consider that area as more chest dominant. But even if you're trying to sing like good high C's as a tenor, you want to think of it as mixing actually. I think that's the only way that we can think about it in a healthy way is we're using more of our higher partials and overtones to create that sound. Um, but it still is like more chest dominant. Now, I think in the vocal pedagogy system, which I want to be more contemporary and classical, is like a way that we're thinking about things, taking a little bit of liberty here because I'm making this a system that doesn't really have this definition. Actually, it's just considered like there are lots of vocal pedagogy systems. Um, I like to think of it as like those notes up there from like A to C and even a little higher are often going to be more in head voice. And it's actually kind of a range extension to try and bring your chest voice up that high. And we'll talk about this and why I would say that because there's another variable we haven't talked about yet. Getting there. Um, so again, with the classical Fox system, think of it as coloratura is like your high, light, and agile. So a coloratura soprano is going to be like the highest operatic soprano who's doing like Queen of the Night kind of stuff and like popping around into these high notes and being light and agile. You might be like, no, that's not a coloratura; it's a lyric. Again, this I'm just trying to give some basic examples that are kind of generally understood by people. Lyrics are going to be a little bit heavier and but still have that lightness to their sound. Then we have like spinto, right, which is going to be a little bit, and so we have all of a sudden some Italian words and things like that. Um, we have a little bit uh, a little bit lower and a little bit heavier, and then we get like dramatic, right? A dramatic soprano is going to be a heavy sounding soprano who kind of sits there and fills out the sound, maybe like a Wagnerian kind of a soprano. There's also like funny little subdivisions like soubrette, which is like a soprano who's sassy and plays like maid roles or like the sassy maid in like a lot of opera things. So you have to understand that some of these things are like names for like the kinds of characters that people like to do. It has a little bit to do with their personality. So that's why I think it's kind of funny when people are like, I'm a soubrette. And it's like, okay, so you're doing like, I don't know, like Marriage of Figaro or something, and you're like the sassy maid, or like you're doing like Papagena or whatever. I don't know. Like there's like certain roles that you're gonna kind of probably do that are in that sort of soubrette sort of position. But again, that's for opera, and that's why I don't know if it's so super helpful as a voice teacher unless you're like very niche, right, with what you're doing. Same thing with tenors, right? So like you get like leggero tenors, where people are like, I'm a leggero tenor. What does that mean? It's like you probably do like Rossini operas and you're like kind of a romantic sounding tenor. Um, I also like that there's this term haute contra, which is like the French version of a very romantic tenor. Some people call it like a countertenor. Like, so I'm like, in my American dialect, I'm like, I'm a hot contra. So that's actually my type in case anyone actually wants to know. I'm a hot contra. So anyways, it's just like this funny because that's like a very particular sort of thing, has to do with like things, French roles, right? In certain operas, where you have like a very romantic, light kind of tenor sound. So you could think of that kind of moving towards like contemporary music. There's a lot of like light romantic sort of tenor sounds where we do lots of mixing and things like that. Um, so you get that. There's like the Helden tenor, right, which is like for Wagnerian things. People will talk about a very heavy, full voice tenor. That's like a very, so again, all these terms, they often have a lot to do with weight and character type. Like there's baritone noble or noble. And that's like thinking about the baritone who plays like the aristocrat in like operatic roles. And there's like a very particular kind of character and a slightly kind of lean tone. So you can look all these up in like the operatic Fach system or other operatic voice classification systems. And that's what's happening there. And that's what they're talking about. But I don't know if that's necessarily helpful for like the majority of singers. I think it's cool to explore as you explore operatic roles if you are interested in opera and classical music. But there's a reason why I kind of leave it out for like generally a lot of 30-day singer stuff, because I think it might serve to over confuse people and maybe make you over focus on like some specific thing that you might develop as a name because of your career and the kind of thing that you're singing. And in that way, like a performance venue might give you that title because of the type of role that you're singing or the types of roles that you sing. So hopefully that starts to make sense to people. But this is why I wanted to do this one, because I've just seen some like contentiousness online about this. And like, I just want people to understand that when it's geared towards a beginner, when we're oversimplifying versus when we're trying to get really specialized. And I think that's something I would save for a lesson for a very particular kind of niche, or talk about it here a little bit. And then, please, again, ask me questions. There's also like the basso buffo, right? Like that's like an example of a bass who plays like a jester, like a maybe kind of like a Falstaff kind of a character or something, who's like a comic role and a bass. So again, right? So find these names that fit your character, and it's fun to give yourself labels, but don't get so lost in it, and like don't get to the please don't be one of those people who like uses that to scoff at other people, because I don't know if that actually serves the community in the way that you may think it does. It might just kind of be like, look, I'm a know-it-all, and I think it's cool to learn all those kinds of things and to understand that history. That's why I talk about like I have classical training to understand like this full spectrum and this whole system, so that I can kind of like explain this to people, and hopefully like demystify the confusion online and why people like will like controversially be like, well, Billie Eilish is a soprano. No, well, she sometimes sings low or whatever, and like get into that place. Like ask her what her voice type is, and that's probably the most important thing to understand. And if you're having issues, then a voice teacher can help you understand some of these parameters so that you can better find the voice types that suit you. And that's often by like going over different pieces and singing them and feeling what it's like, and over time subtly tweaking your technique or the kinds of songs that you're singing so that you can sing in a healthy way, right? So that's really the most important aspect here. Um, Before I forget, the other variable is to talk about your break range, or where your voice switches from chest voice to head voice. This has a little bit to do with tessitura, a little bit to do with technique, right? So you might find that can you can switch your voice in a more dynamic way as you learn to do better mixed voice, to the point where you don't really have a break range very much, and that's like very helpful. And it sounds like your voice just kind of goes seamlessly from chest to head voice. That's what I mean by like when I was talking about the high C thing. Like a good tenor, I think, is going to make a seamless transition. But a lot of tenors, like for example, right around here, like this F sharp to G, before we go up, and this is like a F sharp, what is this, 4 up to G4 around here, maybe G sharp 4. Someone was like, your break range is a G sharp 4. It's funny, interesting, like that someone would understand that from a YouTube video that I did and tell me what my break range is. It's like, it's a very fun, interesting thing. It does fluctuate a little bit, right? And your voice can crack in lots of different places. It's a zone. So it's not a specific spot. It's a zone based on the kind of timbre that your voice has. So if you're going really heavy as you're going up and you're using lower partials, your voice might crack earlier. So again, chest and head voice is a teaching metaphor. And so break range is often defined by somewhat the dysfunction. But there's a reality, there's an acoustic event that happens in people's voices that will make the sort of a spot where you're going to have to transition. That's why people call it the passaggio, or the passageway. It's where we have to be extra careful and not really press on our voice, or make sure that we're really navigating our timbre on our vowel shapes in order to make a smooth transition. So, if I'm going like, yeah. I don't know if you could hear it, but there's a subtle little moment. Like, right? It's funny to make the crack sounds, right? It's like, ooh, don't be ashamed by it. It's actually fairly healthy to find cracks. Don't try to like resist them, but you might find that you'd be a little confused about where your break range is, because it's more of a concept. An acoustic event tends, for a lot of tenors, it tends to be around F sharp, F to G sharp, maybe. So that means that by the time you get to this high C, you're probably doing some mixed voice function. Now, this also leads to sometimes like people are like, I'm confused. You said you're taking your chest voice up, but you went up to a high A, and that's past your break range. So wouldn't you be in a mixed voice? And it's like, yeah, technically, but like mixed voices probably starts, like if you're doing it well, several notes before that, you're already starting to make a transition in order to make it smooth. So if we're thinking like chest dominant, I'm trying to sing a high A and I'm like working my chest voice and range extension, I'm thinking about, can I carry that chest voice quality higher and sometimes past my break range, right? So again, this is why this is really interesting. And I just want people to understand that like there's complexity to this, and that's why it's not like trying to like, oh, you said something wrong there. It's actually like, if we had to stop and explain all of that all the time, it'd probably be too much talking, right? And that's another thing people say, like, just give me exercises. I just want to feel it out. There's truth to that. I really understand that. But like, there's a reason why we're not always fully explaining everything all the time like that. I think that's something you learn in your lessons when you work with someone. But if we're like, online as a community, like sometimes we have to streamline that so we can make an efficient video, right? So again, just want to explain and express that like someone singing a high A, like as a tenor, is probably starting it. If you're doing it healthy, you want not using a lot of weight, it's probably starting to mix. So in a classical setting, if you're going to a high C, you're very much probably mixing at that point, like if you want to do it in a healthy way. But even then in classical, they'll be like, no, I sing purely chest voice all the way up. just kind of weird because again, those old systems didn't really talk about head voice that much when they were talking about the sort of classical era of opera or like the dramatic era of opera, right? So like the verismo phase, right, where people were trying to get full voiced and it was very heavy sounding. Um, so just understand that break range also plays a role, and think of it like where it's also kind of a tessitura thing, like where do you switch a lot of the time? And what part of your range, like, do you like to sing more in chest voice in general as a timbre and as like in your range sits more in that sort of chest voice area, or do you like to sing more in head voice? And that's another way you can kind of differentiate, like, am I a higher mezzo soprano or a lower mezzo soprano, for example? And therefore, should I sing alto one in choir or should I sing soprano two? Right? So you can see I kind of like to think of all three of these systems depending on what I'm using and kind of use qualities from all of them to hopefully bring us to a new age of understanding. Again, the vocal pedagogy system, I think, borrows from choral, from opera. So we have these different variables. And here it is like, is a flash course. Range, timbre, tessitura, weight, and character, right? If you can do all of those, and the last one, break range. So range, tessitura, timbre, uh, break range, weight, and character, right? I just said it in a different order, but that's really what we're talking about here. And a lot of times it serves for labeling singers for like a venue, or as you're trying to communicate with other singers, or as you're trying to communicate with a conductor or a musical director. Um, Something like, yeah, like that. So not really, because like, so we're talking about the like flageolet sort of thing, like we're like, you're talking about like going into whistle tone kind of a sound. Uh, I It can a little bit, but there are mezzos who can sing in whistle tone. There, I've heard like very like heavy altos. It's more of like an acoustic function or an event, right? And it might happen at different places for different voice types. But typically, sopranos tend to do that more. Like I don't really do whistle tone, although I know like male vocalists can also do whistle tone. There's a word for a type of countertenor called a sopranist, and that's not like a Russian soprano or something like that. If you look up videos like that, and someone who trains to sing countertenor style stuff, but all the way up to like high soprano. Like sometimes when I've warmed my voice up, I can kind of sing into the mezzo soprano realm. Um, so again, that would be considered like trying to sing as a sopranist. But if I did that all the time, it would hurt my voice. And sometimes when I'm working with sopranos, I have to particularly be like, I'm going to be dropping the octave and singing with you because I just can't be doing that all day. In like a recording in a certain context, I can sometimes make a really heavy, high, sort of like head voicey kind of a sound for like a fanfare, things like that. So just understanding your voice, again, that's really the concept here. So that I can consider that like an extended technique. So when we're doing like whistle tone kind of singing, that's an extended head voice technique. And you have to be very careful with doing that kind of stuff. Like you can hurt yourself. And like if you were to do throat singing, for example, and do more like undertones for your sound, that would be sort of a way of doing extended low notes. So it's like if I wanted to be like silly and like overgeneralize, I could be like, well, when I throat sing, I can sing down kind of to this basso profundo sound as a throat singer, because that's sort of weird. And there, women can do throat singing too. A lot of like the famous sort of like Mongolian throat singers are actually, there's a lot of female singers who do it. I could be like, okay, so I can sing that octave, this octave, this octave, this octave, and then I've been able to sing up to high head voice things up to high B's and probably maybe a C. Then I'll be like, well, I have a 4-octave range. And that would be like a really silly thing to say because that's not where actually I'd be singing. I'd be like, I could sing like 2.5 octaves, I think is like a healthy place to be, or 3 octaves if you're really pushing it and you're really at the top of your game and you're keeping like healthy with your voice and really training it. Like a 3-octave range is a very advanced place to be. You don't have to be that doesn't mean that you're a better singer than someone else a lot of the time, because you might be sacrificing timbre, you might be sounding shrill or kind of squeaking or being too loud. So for example, like I could sing up those high soprano notes sometimes, but they're very loud and they take a lot of energy. And that's very different from like a coloratura soprano who could just float around there. And so that's another thing. That's kind of like the weight concept, right? It's like how big and like heavy is it? And so how hard is it to navigate there? So hopefully that gives you, again, like it's crazy that like, again, you could spend a whole hour talking about voice types, but I really just want this to be here for any of you who are like really frustrated and confused about it, and just give you permission to be more flexible about the way that you identify your voice. I've met, like I remember I met the lady who sang Carmen. She sang the Lion King like main solo thing, and we did a gig together, and her voice was lower than my voice, right? So she's a tenor, and often people confuse that, right? So it's just important to note, again, it doesn't have to be gendered. Like my voice sat a little higher than hers, and so if we were singing together, I'd probably want her to be underneath my voice and my voice to be on top, and that'd be really cool, and it would be a great sound. So again, like you don't have to put yourself in a box like that. You can be a tenor, you could be an alto. I've sung alto parts before. I enjoy it. I think it's very fun. So yeah, hopefully you learned a lot. I really appreciate it, and I love seeing familiar names, familiar people showing up, and anyone new. Also, like hopefully this is just a way for you to kind of just get a sense of like this whole thing. And really, again, it's just a label, just to sort of help identify and understand how your voice functions. Cool. I'm gonna put that one down. Dimash singing Hymn à l'amour. I'm just gonna write it down right now. So, I love having different people, different sort of voices to kind of look at and listen to, and that might be a really fun practice. I'll leave you with this concept of go look up different kinds of voices and like listen to them all and get a sense of it that way, right? Like listen to what people think of as a countertenor or sopranist or a contralto, and you can kind of compare by that, by like where does my voice fit in the spectrum of this. I think that's a really healthy way to do all of this, is actually to kind of feel it out by comparing, like compare and contrast, listen, and be like, don't try everything. If you feel like you're hurting yourself trying something, like just, go with feeling. And so that's what I would always say. So you don't have to imitate every sound that you hear. That's where people often hurt themselves. And, sometimes, again, I'm showing people that like you can carry your chest voice up really high. That doesn't mean that you have to follow me like that, but you can take the principles of that for if you're a lower baritone and use that to actually extend your range to another place. I've heard baritones who've sung very full high A's, and it's, back in the day, like when I was doing like these vocal forum things, and like, I was like, whoa, like that's really like blew my mind. Like that guy had really good technique, and he calls himself a baritone because he had a very full sound, but he sang up in the high A's, and I was like working on my high A's at that point, and I like did not have them that solid. So again, it's complex, and it's a lot about what you want. Cool. I love this. Like we should do one sometime where we share some of our favorite recordings and songs and things like that. So anyways, thanks again for following all of this and being a part of it. And, spread the word if people are, you have people who are really confused like that, and are frustrated with it. Like come to these, ask questions, work with a teacher. And again, like hopefully this video will, and similar ones like it, will continue to inform our online world so that we can be a little less sort of like frustrated and angry and more supportive. So as always, it's a pleasure, and I will catch you all next time. All right, take care, everyone.